Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also comment where and what time you're watching from. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. She's done a good job pretending to start over. I'll give her that. New town, new house, even a new haircut. If you didn't know her, you'd think she belonged here, in this tidy little neighborhood with its trimmed lawns and cul-de-sacs. She blends in like wallpaper, like someone who wants to be invisible, but I know better. She'll never disappear from me. The first few months, I kept my distance. That wasn't easy, but it was important. She needed to feel safe, really safe. It makes what comes next all the more satisfying. I learned her schedule first. Monday through Friday, she's out the door by 7 to take the kid to school. After that, it's errands or her part-time job at the grocery store. By 4, she's back home. It's like clockwork. Weekends are different. She keeps the kid close. They bake cookies, watch movies, a real picture-perfect life. I've been in the house twice now. The first time, I didn't touch anything. I just wanted to see how she was living. It's smaller than the place we had, but she's made it nice. Candles on the coffee table, photos of the kid on the wall. She hasn't hung up any of us, though. Not even one from the good days. The second time, I left a little reminder, nothing big, just a pair of earrings I took from the bedroom the night before she left me. I set them on her dresser, right in the middle, where she couldn't miss them. The next day, I saw her through the window. She was in the kitchen, scrubbing the counters like she could clean the memory away. Her hands were shaking. I almost felt bad for her, almost. Then there's the kid, a quiet little thing, just like her mother, always clutching some stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed halfway off. I've been patient with her, careful. But patience only goes so far, and tonight is the night. I watch from the street as she pulls into the driveway. The kid hops out of the car holding that stupid rabbit and runs to the door. She's in such a hurry, she doesn't even notice the man parked 3 houses down. She doesn't see me. She never does. By 8, the lights in the living room are off. The kid's probably in bed. She's in the kitchen, her shadow moving across the curtains as she rinses dishes. I wait until she disappears down the hall, then I move. It doesn't take much to pop the lock on the back door. She's got one of those cheap deadbolts, the kind you can open with a credit card. I step inside, careful to stay on the rugs, so the floors don't creak. The house smells like lemon cleaner and something faintly sweet like vanilla. The kid's room is at the end of the hall. The door is cracked, just enough for me to see her tiny shape curled up under the blankets. The rabbit's on the floor, its chewed ear sticking out like a flag. I step inside and pick it up. The little girl stirs but doesn't wake. When I leave, I take the rabbit with me. By the time she notices the kid is gone, it's after midnight. I hear her calling from the yard as I sit in my car 2 streets over. Her voice is frantic, hoarse. It carries through the stillness, cutting the air in a way that makes me smile. She thinks she's safe in this place, with her neighbors and her porch lights and her picket fence. She thinks this town will protect her. But I've always been closer than she thinks. I glance at the passenger seat. The stuffed rabbit sits there, its glassy black eyes staring at nothing. It's going to be a long night for her, and it's only just beginning. She thought she could get rid of me. People always think that, don't they? That they can throw someone away like rubbish and never have to look back. But she doesn't understand how things work. She doesn't understand me. I've been careful. Careful enough that she doesn't know how close I've been. How many times I've stepped past her door without her ever noticing. It's funny, really, how people think they're safe in places like this. A dormitory, all those locked doors and bright corridors, as if that's enough to keep someone like me out. It wasn't hard to find her. Her habits are so predictable. Every morning she leaves for class at the same time. Her bag slung over one shoulder and her headphones in, staring at her phone as she walks. She always cuts across the green, never looking up, even when someone's passing. It's a wonder she's never tripped or been hit by a car. I know her schedule now. Mondays and Wednesdays, lectures until noon. Fridays, she leaves early but comes back by 2. Evenings, she's usually in her room. I've checked. The messages were just the beginning. I wanted to remind her that I'm still here, that I haven't forgotten. It's strange, though, how she doesn't reply anymore. She used to when it first ended, begging me to leave her alone, swearing it was over, but not now. Now she deletes them and pretends I don't exist. I exist. I've been inside her room twice. The first time she wasn't there. Her bed was unmade, her books piled on the desk. She's tidy in a way that feels forced, like she's trying to prove something. There were photos on the wall, ones I hadn't seen before. Friends from school, family holidays, none of me, not one. The second time I left something for her, just a small token. Her necklace, the one I took the night she ended it. She'd left it in my car and I'd kept it ever since. I placed it carefully on her pillow before I left. I didn't need to wait around to know she found it. She's tried to block me out. A new lock on the door, a security bar across the window. It's almost funny how much trouble she's gone to. None of it matters, of course. Locks only keep out people who care about rules. The footsteps started after that, a simple thing, really. Just the sound of someone walking down her corridor late at night, stopping outside her door. I wanted her to know I was close. Close enough to reach out if I wanted to. Sometimes I'd leave something behind. A bit of mud from my shoe, a faint scuff on the floor where I turned around. Nothing too obvious, just enough to make her wonder. I know she's scared. I can tell by the way she moves now, quicker and smaller, like she's trying to fold in on herself. She checks over her shoulder when she walks across the green, her eyes darting like a bird's. Her curtains stay drawn all the time now. Last night was the moment I've been waiting for. She went to bed early, the light in her window going dark just after 10. I waited outside for hours, listening to the building settle until I was sure everyone else had gone quiet. Her door was locked, of course, but that's never been an issue. A few moments, a little finesse, and I was inside. The room smelled like her, faintly floral, the scent of whatever perfume she's taken to wearing now. Her bed was in the corner, just a shadowed outline in the dim light from her desk lamp. She didn't wake up when I approached. I could see the rise and fall of her breathing, steady and calm, like she had no idea I was standing right there. I didn't touch her. I didn't need to. Instead, I placed the photograph on her desk. One of the ones she thought she'd thrown away. A snapshot of the two of us from last summer before things went bad. Her arm around my shoulders, smiling like we had a future. I wanted her to see it when she woke up. I wanted her to know she'll never be rid of me. The thing is, I'm patient. I can wait. I always have. The cabin was smaller than I'd expected. Bare wood, no frills, and a single window facing out towards the tree line. It was the kind of place she'd have hated a year ago. Too quiet, too lonely, but she wasn't the same anymore, and I suppose that was the point. She came here to get away, to disappear, to leave me behind. She'd always underestimated me. Finding her wasn't hard. A few conversations with the right people. A quick look at her emails before she thought to change her passwords. She'd booked the cabin under her maiden name, which was clever but not clever enough. She was always like that, half measures. I let her settle in for a couple of days before I made my move. I wanted her to feel secure, to let her guard down. There was no rush. I parked a few miles away and walked in, careful to stay off the path. The forest was thicker than I'd anticipated, the ground uneven and littered with leaves that crunched underfoot. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk had fallen. She'd left the curtains open, which was either carelessness or arrogance. I watched her for hours, the light from the lamp shining a soft glow around the room. She paced a lot, carrying a mug from one side of the cabin to the other, sometimes stopping by the window to look out. Once she stood still for so long, I thought she'd spotted me, but then she turned away. When the light finally went out, I approached the car, a battered little thing, the sort of car that screams desperation. It didn't take long to cut the fuel line, though I stayed crouched for a while afterwards, listening to the forest around me. The silence here felt thicker than it did in the city. It wrapped around everything, made the smallest movements feel louder than they had any right to be. By morning, she'd try the car and realize she wasn't going anywhere. I spent that night on the edge of the trees, tucked just out of sight. The cold settled into my bones, but I didn't move. I could hear her pacing again, the soft shuffle of her feet on the floorboards carrying out into the stillness. She was thinking, worrying. I like that. The next day she came outside. I stayed low behind a fallen log not far from the cabin and watched as she inspected the car. She crouched by the front tire, then the rear, her hair falling into her face as she frowned at something she didn't quite understand. She opened the driver's door, sat for a moment, and then slammed it shut again, her movements sharp and jerky. Afterwards, she went back inside and closed the curtains. I spent the rest of the day scouting the area. There was a shed behind the cabin, half buried in brambles and clearly forgotten. Inside, I found a rusted axe and a collection of dull tools. I considered taking the axe just in case, but left it where it was for now. It wasn't time yet. That night, I crept closer to the cabin. I couldn't help myself. The ground around the cabin was soft from the rain earlier, my boots leaving faint impressions in the mud. I circled it twice, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the wooden structure. Then I tried the back door. Locked, of course it was. I knelt by the door and slid a small scrap of paper under the crack, just enough to catch her attention when she woke. She'd read it and know she wasn't alone. When I stepped back, I noticed a faint flicker of movement behind the curtains. It wasn't much, just the suggestion of someone leaning closer to the window. I didn't stay long enough to be certain. The next morning, she didn't come outside. I kept my distance, watching from a higher point in the forest. Her curtains stayed drawn the entire day. I could feel her panic from here, the way she moved inside the small space, restless and uncertain. It wouldn't be long now. By the time the sun began to set, I was closer again, crouched behind the shed. The cabin looked dark and quiet, the way it had the night before. My fingers brushed the handle of the axe as I stood, but I didn't take it with me. I moved around to the back of the cabin and tried the door again. This time it opened. Inside it was warmer than I'd expected. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and damp wood. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, picking out the shapes of furniture and the faint outline of her bags by the door. I stood still, listening. Somewhere deeper in the cabin, a floorboard creaked. People think they can vanish if they run far enough. Change your name, delete your accounts, leave the city. You'll be free. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't work that way. It never does. He thought he was clever. A new city, new job, an entire life scrubbed of anything that could lead back to me. As if a man's whole existence could be reduced to passwords and paperwork. He should have known better. I've always been thorough. It wasn't hard to track him down. I still had his old phone when he left me, tucked in the drawer beside the bed we used to share. His work emails weren't as secure as he thought, and a few late nights trawling through his correspondence gave me the trail I needed. Once I had the city, the rest was just a matter of patience. The first time I saw him again, it was from across the street. He was wearing his coat open, his scarf trailing loosely as he stepped into a coffee shop. His walk was the same, the slight tilt of his head as if he were listening to something just behind him. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the night he left. I waited outside until he came back out. He hadn't changed much, his hair was shorter, but the way he held his cup with both hands was exactly the same. I followed him to his building, keeping enough distance that he wouldn't notice me. His flat was on the 3rd floor, with a window that overlooked a row of bins in the back alley. I counted the steps from the street to his door before I walked away. The next few weeks were just for observation. I mapped out his routine, the paths he took to work and back, the nights he spent alone versus the ones where he went to the pub. I followed him to the supermarket once, walking behind him as he browsed the frozen meals and picked up a bag of apples. He hesitated over a bottle of wine, then put it back. He never looked over his shoulder, not once. I started leaving little things for him to find, nothing too obvious. An old book from his childhood slipped into his postbox. A shirt I used to wear folded neatly and left on the landing outside his door. A photograph from the holiday we took in Brighton tucked into the frame of his bathroom mirror. I imagined the confusion on his face when he found them, the faint curl of his lips as he tried to convince himself it was all a coincidence. It was important to me that he knew I was close. The break-in was a spur-of-the-moment thing. He'd gone out for the evening, and I couldn't resist. The lock on his door was laughable. 5 minutes, and I was inside. The flat smelled faintly of the air freshener he used to spray in his old car, that same sickly sweetness that made my stomach turn. I didn't take anything. That wasn't the point. Instead, I rearranged the furniture slightly, a chair angled differently, a book moved from one shelf to another. I wanted him to feel it when he came back, that sense of something being just out of place. I left one of his shirts on the bed before I slipped out. It was an old one from before he started buying those button-ups that made him look like he belonged in an office. He'd know it was from me. The next day he walked faster. His head moved from side to side more often, scanning the street, the windows above. I followed him to the pub and waited outside until he came out, his eyes darting nervously as he made his way home. He was starting to understand. That night, I let myself back in. The flat was dark and cold, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I stood in the kitchen for a while, running my fingers along the edges of the counter. Then I opened his wardrobe and took out one of his jackets. The floorboard in the hallway creaked. I froze, listening. My heart thumped in my chest, but I didn't move. A faint outline appeared in the doorway, his silhouette just visible in the dim light from the street lamp outside. He stood there for what felt like hours, motionless, before he stepped back and closed the door. I stayed where I was, my fingers clenched around the fabric of his jacket. It's only a matter of time. He'll come to me eventually. They always do. It was easy to learn the codes. She used the same ones for everything. Her birthday, the year she graduated, things she thought no one would notice. I'd watched her type them in dozens of times before she left me. Even now, I could picture the way her thumb hovered just slightly over the keypad before pressing each number, like she was double-checking in her head. When I heard she'd installed a security system, I laughed, as if a keypad and a few sensors would be enough to keep me out. I waited a few weeks after she moved back into her house. Long enough for her to feel safe again, to let the tension in her shoulders ease when she locked the door at night. She'd left me because I made her nervous, or so she'd said. It wasn't fair, really. All I'd ever done was love her. I parked 2 streets away and walked the rest of the way in darkness. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people kept their curtains shut tight and pretended not to hear anything unusual. Her house stood out, though. New paint on the front door, a porch light glowing faintly. She'd always liked things neat and inviting, even when she didn't want anyone to visit. The security keypad was just inside the door. I punched in the code without hesitation and felt the faint click as the lock disengaged. There was no alarm. Her house smelled the same as it always had. Lavender and something faintly chemical, like she'd sprayed air freshener just before leaving the room. The hallway light was on, casting a faint glow into the living room. Her shoes were by the door, lined up neatly like soldiers. I stepped around them and let the door swing shut behind me. It felt strange being back inside. Everything was so familiar. The rug she'd bought on impulse last Christmas, the framed photos on the wall, the glass vase on the table in the corner. I moved through the room silently, taking my time. Upstairs, her bedroom door was ajar. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. Instead, I turned my attention to the rest of the house, making small adjustments here and there. A cupboard door left slightly open, a chair moved just a little out of place, the thermostat dialed down to the lowest setting. She was always cold at night. I checked the locks on the windows too, twisting them so they wouldn't open without force. Her phone was charging on the kitchen counter. I disconnected it and slipped it into a drawer. Then I waited. I stayed in the corner of the living room, near the window where the shadows pooled deep enough to hide me. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, steady and low. She wouldn't be home for hours. I'd checked her calendar before coming here, but I didn't mind. I wanted everything to be just right when she arrived. The first sign of her return was the sound of her keys in the door. I could feel the shift in the air as she stepped inside, the small, unintentional noises she made as she moved through the house. She didn't notice the cupboard door or the chair. She would, though. It wasn't until she went to adjust the thermostat that she stopped. I heard her footsteps pause, the faint rustle of her clothes, as she turned toward the kitchen. She'd check her phone next. She called out. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the tone. Sharp, with a thread of something anxious woven through it. I smiled. She'd try the windows soon, and then the front door. She'd realized none of them would open. I stepped back further into the corner, letting the darkness close in around me. It was going to be a long night. She hadn't changed much. A new haircut, shorter than before, and the way she carried herself was different. Straighter back, head a little higher, like she thought she'd finally got away from me, but beneath all that she was still her. Same small hands, same faint scar on her wrist from when she broke a glass washing up. I'd always liked that scar. It reminded me she could be careless, no matter how much she wanted to seem in control. Finding her took longer than I expected. She was careful, I'll give her that. Deleted her accounts, changed her number, left nothing behind, but everyone has a weak spot. Her mum still used the same email, and she never could resist a message from her daughter. It was just a question of hacking the inbox, tracing the breadcrumbs. A flat in Birmingham, a new job in the city centre. The job was perfect. Small company, easy enough to bluff my way into. I'd kept the references from my last place, made sure everything looked tidy. The interview was a formality. I'd always been good at talking to people, convincing them of things. By the time they rang with the offer, I'd already worked out her desk number, her shift patterns, the way she left the office for lunch at exactly 1 o'clock. Seeing her that first day was like breathing again after being underwater too long. She froze when she spotted me, eyes darting around like a trapped animal, but I smiled, friendly, professional, like there was nothing unusual about me being there. She forced herself to smile back. It didn't reach her eyes. I kept my distance to begin with, just long enough for her to convince herself it was a coincidence. I made sure to keep everything casual, no reason for her to complain to anyone. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted whenever I walked by. She started leaving the office earlier than usual, glancing over her shoulder as she headed for the car park. I stayed behind, watching from the window on the second floor as her car pulled out into the street. After a few weeks, I began leaving little signs for her, subtle things. Her desk drawer, slightly ajar when she came in one morning. A file left on her chair, the wrong file, but one I knew she'd recognize. Once I sent her an anonymous email, a single sentence, something only I would say. I imagined her sitting at her desk, staring at the screen, trying to convince herself it was a coincidence. It wasn't about hurting her, not yet. It was about showing her she couldn't escape, not really. No matter where she ran, I'd find her. One night, I stayed late at the office, waiting for her to leave. She worked longer than usual, and I listened to the faint clatter of her keyboard from my spot down the corridor. Eventually, the lights in her section went out and her footsteps moved towards the door. Once the building was silent, I walked to her desk. It was neat as always, everything lined up in its place. I moved a few things, a pen lying parallel to her notebook, now slightly askew. A photo frame turned just a little to the left, enough for her to notice when she came in the next morning. The drawer on the right-hand side was locked, but the lock was cheap. I opened it easily and slid a small item inside, a locket she'd given back to me when she left. The following day, she didn't look at me once. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she typed. I smiled whenever I passed her desk, but I kept my distance. That night, I followed her home. Her flat was small, on the top floor of a red brick building with no lift. I parked across the street and waited. The lights in her windows went on, then off as she moved through the rooms. When everything was dark, I got out of the car and walked up the stairwell to her floor. The door was cheap, the kind that could be opened with a credit card and a bit of force. Inside, her scent lingered faintly in the air, something floral like jasmine. I moved through the flat quietly, taking in the details, the pile of post on the kitchen counter, the blanket folded neatly on the sofa, the mug left on the coffee table with the dregs of her tea still inside. In her bedroom, the wardrobe stood slightly open. Her clothes were hung in neat rows, shoes lined up beneath them. I reached out and brushed my fingers against the fabric of her coat, the same coat she'd worn on our trip to Cornwall last year. Before I left, I opened her bedside drawer and placed a single object inside. A photo of us, torn in half, with her face still visible on one side. The next day, she didn't come into work. I waited in the office, listening to the conversations around me, the faint rattle of keyboards. When someone mentioned she was off sick, I smiled and nodded, pretending not to care. But I knew she was at home, staring at that photo, wondering what I was planning. She'd find out soon enough. I didn't pick this apartment. They did. Witness protection, that is. It's in the kind of neighborhood where people keep their heads down and pretend not to notice much. The walls are thin, the windows stick in their frames, and the air smells faintly of mildew, no matter how much I clean. It's not home, but it's where I'm supposed to be safe. The first thing I noticed was the cologne. I was coming back from the store, juggling bags and fumbling with my keys in the dark hallway outside my door. As I stepped inside, I caught a faint scent, sharp and familiar. It cut through the stale air in the apartment like a knife. His cologne. The same cheap, overpowering brand he always wore. The same one that clung to my skin when he'd grabbed me too hard or pressed too close. My hands started shaking, so I locked the door and checked it twice. Then I walked through the apartment. All 3 rooms, all 5 closets. I didn't expect to find anything, and I didn't. But I still slept with the lights on that night. The next morning I told myself it was just nerves. Someone at the store maybe, or in the hallway. I couldn't let myself spiral, not again. That's what I thought anyway, until the lights started turning on by themselves. It happened 2 days later. I'd been at work all day, waiting tables at a dingy little diner 2 blocks over. When I came home, the lamp in the living room was on. I hadn't left it that way. I checked every corner of the apartment again, my heart racing the whole time. Nothing was missing and nothing looked disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, maybe still was. The neighbor downstairs, an old man named Gus, who liked to sit on the stoop and smoke, mentioned something the next day. He said he'd seen a man hanging around outside my building the night before, leaning against the wall like he was waiting for something. Gus said he thought about calling the cops, but figured the guy would move along. I wanted to ask what the man looked like, but my throat closed up. I already knew what Gus would say. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the pipes set me on edge. I stopped leaving the apartment unless I absolutely had to. I kept the blinds down and the doors locked. At night, I sat at the kitchen table with a knife in my hand and the phone in front of me, ready to dial 911, just in case. I thought about telling the marshals, but I didn't. They'd already moved me twice. Another relocation would mean starting over again. Another fake name, another crappy apartment, another job where no one could know who I really was. I was tired of running. I should have called them. I woke up last night to the sound of the bedroom door opening. It didn't swing open fast or hard, just slow enough that the hinges didn't even creak. I held my breath and stared at the doorway. My eyes adjusted to the darkness just enough to see a figure standing there, silhouetted against the faint light from the street lamp outside. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just stood there, blocking the doorway. I gripped the knife I'd started keeping under my pillow. My palms were slick and my whole body felt frozen, like if I so much as breathed too loudly he'd pounce. "Darlene," he said finally in a voice I knew too well. Soft, almost sweet, the way he used to talk when he was trying to make me forget the bruises. My name isn't Darlene anymore. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me clutching the knife, him just standing there, but eventually he took a step forward, and then another. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. When he was close enough that I could see his face, something snapped inside me. I swung the knife, aiming for his chest, his throat, anything I could reach. The blade cut through air. There was no one there. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun came up, I checked the locks, the windows, the closets, all secure. No sign of him anywhere, but when I went to the kitchen, the knife I'd been holding was sitting on the counter, clean, dry, like it had never left its place. And the faint smell of cologne was back. I think he's here. Somewhere, waiting for me to let my guard down. This apartment was supposed to keep me safe, but I don't think there's anywhere left to go. I found the house in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't much, just a small two-bedroom cottage tucked away on the edge of some woods, but it was mine. Or at least it would be. The kind of place where you could breathe again, think again. After everything with her, I needed that more than anything. The first week was peaceful. The silence felt like a luxury. No shouting, no slammed doors, just the quiet peace of the countryside. The air tasted different here, clearer somehow. I spent my days unpacking, fixing up the place. It was simple work, and I'd done it 1,000 times before, but it felt good. But then the little things started happening. I woke up one morning to find my front door ajar. It hadn't been locked the night before. I was sure of it. I always checked. I locked it, turned the deadbolt, double-checked. But it was open when I went downstairs, not wide open, but enough to make me stop. A feeling settled in my chest, tight and uncomfortable. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought. Maybe it wasn't latched properly. I didn't think much of it until the next week when I noticed the tire on my car was flat, completely deflated. It wasn't the kind of thing that just happens. Someone had done it, but I had no idea who. The neighbors were all either too far away to have heard anything or just strange, distant folks who didn't seem like the type to cause trouble. Still, it didn't feel right. I replaced the tire, told myself it was a freak accident, but by the time the second flat tire happened, I was starting to get the sense that something wasn't normal, something in the air, something I couldn't place. I put a security camera in the back of the house, just in case. Figured it would make me feel safer, like I wasn't just imagining things. I installed a couple more locks on the doors too. I didn't need to, but I did anyway. I couldn't stop myself. I kept finding myself looking over my shoulder. One night I was in the living room flicking through some old records I found in a box when I saw something through the window. Someone walking past the edge of the yard, moving just out of view. I froze. The figure didn't stop, didn't hesitate, just walked straight across the lawn and disappeared into the trees. It wasn't enough to be sure. It wasn't clear enough to be certain, but I knew in the pit of my stomach. The next day, the neighbor across the street stopped by. He had a weird look on his face, like he was trying to figure out whether to say something or not. He looked at the ground when he spoke, not at me. Said something about seeing a car parked outside my place the other night, a car he didn't recognize. Said he didn't want to alarm me, but thought I should know. I thanked him, told him I appreciated it. I didn't know what to think, but it set my nerves on edge. It wasn't until I went to the local shop a few days later that I saw her. She was standing there, at the end of an aisle, staring at something on a shelf. She didn't see me, but when she did, she froze just like I did the night she left. I wanted to scream, wanted to shout at her, ask her what the hell she was doing here, but I couldn't. Instead, I turned, walked out of the shop and didn't look back. I wasn't ready to face her. I didn't know how I could face her. The next night, I didn't sleep. I kept looking at the cameras, checking the doors. Then there was a knock at the door. Soft, almost polite, like she knew exactly what she was doing. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The knocking went on for a long time. Eventually, I heard her footsteps retreat, but I stayed there, waiting. Hours passed, but I didn't move. The days bled into one another, and the tension kept building. I couldn't keep track of time anymore. It felt like everything was slipping through my fingers. The feeling of being watched was constant, creeping in every moment. The phone rang that night. It was a blocked number. I almost didn't pick up, but I did, just to hear her voice again. "You think I'm done with you, don't you?" she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "You think you're safe?" The line went dead. I threw the phone down, but it didn't help. The tightness in my chest didn't go away. I knew it wasn't over. I knew she was here, watching, waiting. I can't explain how, but somehow I knew she'd been following me all along. Every step, every move, she had planned it. This wasn't just about me leaving. It was about making sure I couldn't escape. I tried to block it out, tried to make myself believe it wasn't happening. But when I saw her car parked outside my house a few days later, it was all too clear. She'd been here longer than I thought. There was no way out now.